everyone. Welcome into another edition of the Behind the Rails of Purdue Football podcast on the Believe Network. I'm your host, Brice Vance. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. This episode, as you can see from the title, is going to be a little bit different. It's not just going to be a preview or a recap, as we've already recapped the Wisconsin game last Friday. And then we are yet to have previewed the Illinois game, which is coming up later this week. And we'll still do a preview. We're going to preview the game in depth, just like we always do, and we'll have that episode out bright and early Thursday morning for you guys. But since we had such a long gap in between recordings, I wanted to kind of just get an update or an outsider's perspective on Purdue and on the Big Ten as a whole. So I reached out to someone else in the Believe Network, and if you're not already listening to their show, you should. It's Jeff Thurn from the Big Ten Show on the Believe Network. Him and Adam Carricker do a great job of looking at the Big Ten as a whole. You can catch their show on the Believe Network. So make sure you guys are checking them out if you are not only a Purdue fan but a Big Ten fan as well and want more than just Purdue football here on the Believe Network. Make sure you go check their show out as well. So we'll have Jeff Thurn coming up here in just a second. But before we get into that, I wanted to tell you guys that since you guys have been tuning into the show, subscribing, rating, reviewing, we have a sponsor. And we have a sponsor on the show, and it's Bet Online. So they believe in what we're doing just because you guys are believing in what we're doing. And we're growing the show, and we're making it more popular. And it's all thanks to you guys. But it's also thanks to Bet Online. And Bet Online is your number one information source for all your sports wagering info, up to the minute stats, news, scores, matchup breakdowns. Get the latest odds, spreads, totals from the NFL to college football at your fingertips with Bet Online's real-time updates on statistics, news, and odds. From week 1 all the way to the end of the season to the college football playoff and Super Bowl, Bet Online gives you access to the best football promotions and contests available anywhere. All you have to do is head to the website today or use your mobile device to get in on the action. Remember to use promo code BELIEVE, that is BLEAV, BELIEVE, to receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Bet Online, where the game starts. So thank you to those guys. They are making sure that what we give you here on the Behind the Rails of Purdue Football podcast is totally free, costs you nothing, thanks to this sponsor. And make sure you are hitting that subscribe, like the video, give your comments. I love the people that are commenting on the videos as well and giving feedback. Been able to go back and forth with some of those commenters on there. So it's been a whole lot of fun getting to see the perspective of the fan. And then going back and forth with a couple of you guys in a positive manner. Some of those negative feedbacks or not, criticisms don't address, and mostly those are Fresno State fans or Syracuse fans. So, but we welcome them all. We welcome all the viewers and listeners here. So make sure you are subscribing, following wherever you are listening or watching to the podcast here on the Believe Network. So I appreciate you guys for tuning in. And thanks again for doing so. So, without further ado, from the Big Ten Show on the Believe Network, here's Jeff Thurn. All right, now we welcome in first guest ever here on the Behind the Rails podcast. We have Jeff Thurn from the Big Ten Show on the Believe Network. Thanks for joining me here today, Jeff.
Hey, man, pleasure to be with you guys. Certainly, it's been an interesting start to the Big Ten football season, and we got a lot of ways to go. So been fun so far, man, but plenty more down the road.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I wanted to bring you on to talk Big Ten as a whole, but I also wanted to get your thoughts on Purdue here as we are a Purdue-centric show. So first, thoughts on the Boilermakers as they are 4 games into this season. What are your positive takeaways and what are some of your negative takeaways from Purdue so far?
Well, I can say one of the positives is there's still more games to be played. When you sit at 1-3, there's still improvement to be made. And when you go from one coach to the next, it's not just an easy transition. Sometimes you hit lightning in a bottle and you just take off like Mel Tucker in Michigan State, but then you come back to life like the Spartans have the last couple of years. Sometimes it takes a couple of years to get your guys in there. And I think with Purdue having the success offensively a year ago, you thought, all right, maybe we're going to be able to sort of build off of the offense, but we're bringing in a guy in Ryan Walters who had a stout defense at Illinois. Didn't hurt that he had some really good NFL talent on that defense as well. But, you watch the way that this defense has played to start the year, especially against Wisconsin, man. They got manhandled in that game. The physicality part of what Ryan Walters was all about at Illinois, I just thought was lacking against the Badgers. And, you start to look at some of those non-conference games, the losses that you have there, and you circle them and go, dang, man, we have some winnable games maybe in the future against Northwestern, against Indiana. Who knows what happens with Nebraska? And you're trying to get to that number 6 to get to the bowls. And so I think you look ahead at the schedule, it's going to be tough to get to 6 when you sit with just one win. And I think it's going to be more about let's build this thing the right way. Ryan Walters is a guy that's, I think, a year younger than me. I think he's 37 years old. And so if he wants to get that next job that comes after Purdue, it seemingly usually is a stepping stone to somewhere else. You have to build it the right way. So the next AD is going to be like, all right, I like what you're doing, and we're gonna sign you on for a lot more money at a more high profile job. The defense is going to be key, and then I think just trying to figure out ways to, at a school, as you coach them up more than you recruit 5 stars, right? So obviously, it's going to be about how he has a great coaching staff developing these young players in the system that they want. So I would say it's tough to grab a lot of positives from the start that they have, although there are a lot more games to sort of figure it out. And I don't think anybody realistically thought, okay, Purdue makes the Big Ten title game a year ago. They get a new head coach and they're going to find themselves in that same spot next year. The problem becomes, as you know, the Big Ten West is going to go away and they're going to take the top 2 teams. And so, like, for Iowa this year, it was a chance maybe to get back to a Big Ten title game. It's going to be very hard to do that in the future. It's going to be very hard for Purdue to crack that top 2. So, you have to have different, goals if you're the Boilermakers. And I think this year is going to be about establishing what are realistic goals for Coach Walters moving forward.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. You mentioned, having measured expectations with the conference, adding those 4 teams from the West Coast, and it's going to be very challenging for Purdue, the likes of Iowa, like you said, and even like a Minnesota type, all those teams that, have kind of been around that 6 to 9 win mark for, it feels like the last 10 years or even longer are going to struggle to get to, what it's going to take to challenge the likes of the Michigans and Ohio States. And then you add in USC and Washington and Oregon to that mix is going to be definitely a lot more challenging. And I definitely, want to get into the Big Ten West kind of as a whole, but just one more question here on Purdue. When a lot of people were coming into this season, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, it was going to be somewhat of a rebuild with the bringing in the new coaching staff. But I was a little bit more optimistic, thinking that, they could make a bowl this year just based on the schedule and the talent that they at least brought in for this coming season. Do you think that we are now realizing that they have a little bit further to go as far as a rebuild? Is it more of a tearing it down, not all the way down to the studs, but it's going to be a little bit more of a significant rebuild than what we thought?
Yeah, I think maybe, you change those expectations on the fly, because I would have agreed with you. I would have thought, they're not going to make the Big Ten title game again, but this team can, figure out 6 wins when you're playing the likes of Syracuse and Fresno State and, Virginia Tech, which they ended up winning. You got that tough one there against Wisconsin to get into some Big Ten action. But you do have Northwestern and Indiana on your schedule, and any Big Ten team that looks on their schedule and goes, I got Indiana and Northwestern on my schedule, you got to feel good that you have a chance to pick up 2 dubs there. Nebraska still has, listen, they've won two times in the last 2 weeks against Northern Illinois and Louisiana Tech. That's on Purdue's schedule moving forward. Minnesota just blew a huge lead in the final 8 minutes of a game to Northwestern. And I know I'm saying, well, you can beat Northwestern. That may mean you can beat Minnesota too, right? Like, Minnesota's trying to figure out their offense. as they navigate this season too. So I think the 1-3 start is so crappy for a new head coach to try to go, all right, the building blocks are there. We're going to do something soon. But also when you have the games in front of you and even a 5-win season when you feel like maybe you're rebuilding the whole thing, isn't, a catastrophe. It could be way worse. But I think you got to get to 5 to really feel like this thing is heading in the right direction year one.
Yeah, and I think I even had some people messaging me after the Wisconsin game, saying how we're gonna have to measure this team going forward. It might not be so just within the win column. It might be we don't have as many penalties, we don't turn the ball over as much as we have in the last 2 weeks. I mean, I think it's combined 6 turnovers, and it could have been more with how many times they fumbled the ball away against Syracuse that just ended up getting back into their own hands. You just have to feel like you have to measure this team in a different way than just in the win column. For more on the West, I mean, obviously it feels like Purdue can be competitive in just about every game that they play against the West. They have obviously Michigan and Ohio State on their schedule, and I don't know if they'll be really competitive in those games whatsoever. But it feels like with the rest of the Big Ten West, and they have Illinois this week and then Iowa the week after, it still feels like Purdue can be competitive in those games, and they feel like 50-50 games at this point.
You bring up Illinois. I mean, Ryan knows that team as well as anybody, and so you go into this one with a defense that has been struggling so far. They're in Champaign. It doesn't look the same, and as I mentioned, they lost some top-tier talent to the National Football League. But I think Illinois is one of those teams that you could also circle and say it feels like it could be a coin flip for us. But I don't know that anybody's going to actually win the West other than Wisconsin or Iowa. Like I've watched Minnesota multiple times this year. I've seen Nebraska multiple times this year. I've caught a little bit of Northwestern. You look at the roster and it's shocking that they beat Minnesota, and the way Minnesota collapsed in the second half last week. I just don't think that they are going to be consistent enough to find themselves winning the West. So I think it's a 2-team race there. And I don't feel like because Purdue isn't in that realm that they should be like, oh, we're absolutely terrible. I mean, you're in a group of 4 or 5 other schools that are trying to figure out sort of, what they're going to be moving forward in a much different Big Ten. And I think right now on the fly, whether it's, you could circle Illinois, you could circle Nebraska, Purdue, whoever in the West, and say, listen, man, things just went from hard to harder as we add USC, as we add UCLA, as we add the likes of Oregon and Washington. You got to understand it's going to have to take a monumental leap for you to be in the conversation of the top 2 moving forward. So, yeah, I just think it's going to be, with realignment comes new expectations for certain programs, and I would circle all those as trying to figure out what are realistic expectations in a new Big Ten.
Since Purdue plays Illinois this weekend, what have you seen from the Illini that should make Purdue fans feel somewhat optimistic that they can welcome them in and leave them with a victory?
Well, their defense hasn't been as good, number one, and I think you got to feel good that the odds makers like your chances. I mean, they've installed Purdue as a 1-point favorite in this game. Now, ESPN's analytics feel a little bit differently. 53% chance that Illinois wins this contest. Yards allowed for both of these teams is very similar. They're allowing over 400 yards per game. So I have a feeling like this could be a shootout. And typically Illinois isn't a team that you talk about having high profile offenses. I just think that there's going to be a chance here because the defenses have been so bad for them to both score the football. I think you mentioned it earlier with the Wisconsin game and even against Syracuse that the turnovers were a big part of that. Wisconsin's defense got really going there and they were forcing turnovers. But I think it's going to be about turnovers in this game. When 2 teams give up over 400 yards, it's which team gives up the least amount of turnovers is what I think ultimately is the determining factor here as we get towards the game coming up on Saturday. And I also think too with this, Illinois on the flip side of things, they got to find their identity too. I know they're 2-2, but man, this doesn't look at all like the same team that got off to that hot start in 2022. So, you find a team that's maybe licking their wounds a little bit too. I used to be a shootout, man. I don't remember what the over-under is 53.5. So the odds makers are expecting a close game and a shootout, installing Purdue as a 1-point favorite. And I think that's what we're going to get.
Yeah, I just don't know where you talk about Illinois trying to find their identity, and Purdue knows what they want to be, but I just don't think they've found it yet. They want to be that air raid, type offense that's throwing the ball deep downfield, and they've really haven't had a whole lot to speak of. They've had a couple of shots to Deion Burks and TJ Sheffield, but it's really been limited, and so's their rushing attack, outside of a couple of decent performances from Tracy and Mockabee, who really was kind of nowhere to be found last week against Wisconsin. So, is there anybody in the Big Ten West that can compete with the top three on the Eastern side?
So I've said this all year, and you may think I need to be drug tested, and that's fine. But I know they can't score any points. Yeah. But I think it's Iowa's defense that can slow down the likes of an Ohio State, a Michigan, or a Penn State if the ball is bouncing their way. I mean, last week it was atrocious. You could go, well, what are you talking about? Penn State just mollywopped them all over the field. It's true, but I think Penn State is the best team in the Big Ten. I think Michigan deserves to sit at that top spot in our power rankings, which we do each week, because nobody's knocked them off the mantle from winning it a year ago. But if you were to tell me neutral site, Council Bluffs, Iowa, middle of the country, these two teams are playing Penn State and Michigan, I'm going to take Penn State over Michigan. I think they do enough on both sides of the ball that they could neutralize some of the great things that Blake Corum does, that offense does, that the quarterback does at Michigan. I do not find myself convinced that Ohio State is the same Ohio State that we've seen the last couple of years. They only scored, and I know Notre Dame's defense is solid, but they only scored 17 points, and the last touchdown came at the end of the game with 1 second left. That's not the same offense that we've seen in the past. And I don't know what's going wrong with that passing game, but it just doesn't feel the same. And their highest output came against a subpar team 2 weeks ago. So I would say Iowa's defense in the right spot could slow them down. And, you would have to have the game of the Hawkeyes' life to pull that off. I would say Wisconsin is the other one, but we talk about identity. I'm trying to figure out what this is really going to look like with Luke Fickell from an offensive standpoint. He walks into the program with a bunch of players that were recruited for a different style offense than what he runs. Now, they've done a really good job, I think, sort of mixing and matching some of that personnel to kind of fit what is maybe a hybrid of what Luke Fickell's offense will look like moving forward. You guys saw that defense, though, when they start clicking, man, they always figure out ways to turn the football over. So I would probably say Iowa, and I'm going to hold on to that until Iowa loses a second or a third game and Baby Ferentz is fired as the OC and that thing's a complete dumpster fire. But I think at this point, those would be the two teams that I'd say in the right situation could slow down. I mean, even last year, did anybody think Purdue was going to hang as long as they did in the Big Ten title game? If they had any defense in that game, it might have come down to the final possession, right? Like they played a really good game against a tough opponent. But I just think at this point, it's probably going to be one of those teams from the East that represents the Big Ten championship.
Yeah, I think I probably know your answer here to my last question. Who has looked the most impressive so far in the East? Is it Penn State?
I think Penn State has looked the most impressive, but that doesn't, we're talking about kind of a very slim difference between the two. And yeah. I think the fact that, and I know you're involved in the coaching staff and you're involved in the game plan, but you can't be there on Saturdays. I think Coach Harbaugh's absence, like there's some bravado to him being on the sideline. There's some confidence to that. His vision for what a game should look like is what has helped them climb this mountaintop and get to the top and be the team that people are trying to knock off. So I think him coming back was a breath of fresh air for the Wolverines. And I think that's going to be, for a great team, it doesn't affect them maybe as much as a subpar team. But I think that's an added boost that they certainly going to love. And they have a chip on their shoulder, even though externally we may all think that what happened at Michigan was minute compared to what some of the bigger problems are that the NCAA has to deal with. It still cost their coach multiple games on the sideline. And I think the players are going to have some sort of chip on their shoulder. And there's people like me that don't believe they're as good as Penn State, yet Michigan's the team that's sitting there atop the Big Ten from a year ago. I would say Penn State has done everything I thought they would and more. Drew Allar's played great at quarterback. I think he's only going to improve as the season goes on. And I really believe that sometimes when you get Ohio State and you get Michigan in the regular season versus having to play them maybe in a Big Ten title game like the teams from the West have to do, There's a little bit more wonky stuff I think that happens in the regular season than conference championship games for whatever reason. And so if Penn State can get through those two, I mean, listen, if Penn State loses one of those games and then runs the table the rest of the way, they may still be in that college football playoff conversation, just depending on how everything else shakes out. And I think this is the best team James Franklin has had so far with the Nittany Lions. And that's why I would say it's probably Penn State that I think is the best team.
Yeah, I think a lot of the people before the season, if one conference was going to get 2 win, obviously it's everybody always thinks the SEC, but it feels like more and more, even if like you mentioned, Penn State gets 1 loss, or Ohio State gets 1 loss along the way after they escape South Bend with a victory this past weekend. It feels like that there's still a possibility that there are that the Big Ten does get 2 into the college football playoff. Obviously, everything else has to fall into place for that to happen as well.
Yeah, no doubt, man. And I think if we were actually to an expanded playoff, I think you'd be talking about all 3 of those teams having a spot in the college football playoff with Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan. And then, who would ever think that the Big Ten West team, I know we're not going to be in that scenario, but they were to win, like, say some random team wins and these were the 3 teams that were below them. I think I'd take those 3 teams over a lot of what I've seen from the SEC or the other Power 5 conferences too. The Big Ten East is really loaded this year, and it's usually loaded with Ohio State and Michigan, and then occasionally Penn State. But I think those 3 teams are right at the top of not only the Big Ten, but the entire country as well.
He's the co-host of the Big Ten Show on the Believe Network. He's Jeff Thurn. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, man, anytime, hit us up. We appreciate it. You guys do great work, and the Believe Podcast Network is awesome. Check out all the shows. I'll give them a shameless plug as well. Check us out on the Big Ten Show, man. We have a lot of fun, me and Adam Carricker. Thanks for letting us come on today, man. I appreciate it.
All righty, thank you. Thanks again to Jeff Thurn of the Big Ten Show on the Believe Network for joining me here on this edition of the Behind the Rails of Purdue Football Podcast on the Believe Network. Now, we still will have a preview show of the Illinois game coming up this week. It'll come out on Thursday morning as usual. Make sure you are subscribed. Make sure you follow the show, whether it's on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or watching right here on the YouTube channel as well. You can give me a follow on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook as well. Just search Brice Vance, and I should be the first one to pop up there. I don't know how many Brice Vances there are actually out there in the world, even though it's hard for me to sometimes find the Twitter handle or the handle on any social media that I don't have to use an underscore or dash or whatever. But what have you? It's all right. I'm getting by. I think we're all getting by in that aspect. So until Thursday, thank you guys so much for tuning in to this podcast, excuse me. And make sure you guys stay tuned coming up later this week as we prepare for the Illinois game coming up on Saturday. So until then, this has been another edition of the Behind the Rails of Purdue Football Podcast on the Believe Network. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you guys on Thursday.